The afternoon sunlight radiated warm rays, shining down on the sparkling towers of the royal palace. The sun gradually sank behind the thin clouds, yet the golden light still gleamed on the pure white walls, enhancing the majestic appearance of the place. Standing in the heart of the capital, the palace served as an eternal symbol of history, where ancient stories continued to echo through time. This scene, calm and dignified, made one feel insignificant in the face of its greatness. The vast grounds of the palace were always bustling with tourists. The sound of laughter, the hurried footsteps of groups rushing to take photos, and admiring the beautiful architecture filled the air. Children played on the cobblestone paths, while adults guided and explained the ancient buildings. The scene seemed all too familiar, but amidst the sea of people, there were quiet, profound moments that only those who witnessed them truly understood their value. Alongside the carefree visitors, the royal guard stood like living statues, symbols of stability and discipline. They wore bright red uniforms, tall hats, sharp and steadfast gazes. Each one of them carried a sacred duty: to protect the royal family, to defend the values that the entire nation revered. Though they stood still like stone statues, their eyes were never distracted. Every action, every movement in the crowd was noticed by them. Stephen Blake, the resolute royal guard, stood at the main entrance of the palace, his eyes seemingly piercing through the surrounding space. He had dedicated 12 years to this mission, standing firm like a soldier loyal to justice and the royal family. No matter how many tourists passed by, he maintained a dignified posture, with not a single movement out of place. This was his responsibility, his pride. The entire space around the palace continued to bustle with activity. Laughter, chatter, the constant clicking of camera shutters. But in that moment, a small yet dangerous shift quietly emerged within the crowd. Stephen Blake, who had painstakingly learned to read every minute detail in his surroundings, suddenly felt an inexplicable sense of unease. A vague wave of anxiety ran down his spine. He knew that ever since he had become a royal guard, these instincts of alertness had become an inseparable part of him. Today, these feelings were more pronounced than ever before, and it was precisely this that made it impossible for him not to pay attention. From where he stood, Blake's sharp eyes caught sight of a group of young men gathering near the palace gates. At first, they were just small figures in the crowd, but the closer he looked, the more he noticed something strange in the way they moved, the way they clustered in a corner as if waiting for something. They didn't seem like ordinary tourists. They appeared out of place, an oddness emanating from their demeanor and their gaze, especially the way they looked at an elderly man standing not far off. Jeffrey Stone, a senior veteran, whom Blake instantly recognized from his worn military coat and the array of shining medals on his chest. But it wasn't just the coat or the medals. There was something in the way this group of young men looked at him that made Blake feel something was very wrong. Jeffrey Stone paused by a small pathway, gripping his cane firmly, looking up at the palace gates. A moment of stillness. His eyes slowly scanned the solid walls of the palace, as if searching for something from the past. The medals on his chest glistened in the afternoon sunlight, each one a story of unforgettable battles, of lost friends. His entire life had been one of service and sacrifice, and now, even in his old age, these medals were an undeniable affirmation of his courage and honor. Yet in that moment, they also became targets for triviality and disdain. A chuckle rang out from the group of young men. One of them, seemingly the leader, pointed toward Stone and signaled for the others to come closer. This time, it was no longer a mere whisper, but open mockery. "See that guy? Do you think those medals are real? Probably bought them from some antique shop." One of the young men sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. The whole group burst into laughter, their mocking words echoing in the air. Blake narrowed his eyes at the group of young men, and a feeling of unease rose within him. He knew this was not just harmless teasing. Stone might have lived through countless brutal battles, but now he was facing individuals who couldn't grasp the true value of the medals he wore. They were not just pieces of metal. They were memories, sacrifices, lives lost. And more than anything, they represented the pride and honor of a soldier. Blake continued to watch as the group of young men moved closer. One of them started to approach, his eyes filled with challenge. Stone showed no sign of backing down. On the contrary, he stood firm, gripping his cane tightly, but not saying a word. Despite his age and weakened health, there was a resilience in his gaze that no one could ignore. Blake could feel it clearly. If he didn't intervene, no one else would. The onlookers might just stand there, but they couldn't understand the significance of this moment. When one of the young men suddenly shoved Stone's shoulder, causing him to stagger and almost fall, Blake felt an alarm go off inside him. People around them began to take notice, but no one dared to act. Stone remained silent, his breath steady, but in his eyes, Blake saw unwavering determination. No fear, only the persistence that could not be shaken. He spoke quietly, but deliberately, with a hint of irritation in his tone. "You don't know anything about these metals." It was a statement, gentle but powerful. But the young men refused to stop. One of them, seemingly the leader, moved closer, bent down, and mocked. "Well then, can you show me one of those medals? Let's see if it's worth anything, or if they're just a bunch of nonsense." Each word, each glance from them, was full of cold, merciless intent. Blake felt his blood rise. He knew he could no longer stand still, no longer just watch this scene unfold. Despite the strict rules he had to follow, this could not continue. The tension felt like a taut string, and eventually it snapped. The insults were more than enough, and the actions of these individuals would not go unpunished. Blake stepped forward, without a word, his gaze filled with resolve and responsibility. He moved into the midst of the young men, extending the silence, and like the crack of thunder, he shouted loudly, "Stop right now." The sunlight had begun to soften, but the air around the palace grounds grew suffocating and heavy, as if the sky itself could feel the tension in the hearts of everyone present. Stephen Blake stood firm, his eyes never leaving the group of young men in front of him. Although he had only just entered this situation, he could clearly sense one thing. This was not a simple provocation. It was a challenge, an affront to the dignity not only of a veteran, but of an entire generation that had given its youth and lives to the country. Blake's voice was cold and firm, but beneath it, there was an undercurrent of tension and concern. He could not allow such an act to continue without intervention. A part of him, the soldier honed through many years of service, knew that silence was never a solution when faced with the provocation of those who did not understand the value of duty and honor. He had learned that sometimes duty required you to confront and defend what you believe in, even if the action could change everything around you forever. Yet even so, Blake could not shake a sense of doubt. Was he being too aggressive? Was he losing himself by placing too much importance on a soldier's principles? He could not ignore the harm that Mr. Jeffrey Stone was enduring, but he also knew that his actions could cause his entire career to collapse. The inner conflict gnawed at Blake's mind. While Blake was still contemplating, the young men began to react. The largest and most vocal of the group, the leader, was not surprised. On the contrary, he seemed even more excited. He stood tall, his eyes flashing with challenge and disdain. "What do you want to do?" he asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Do you think a soldier like you can stop us? Who do you think you are? What can you possibly do?" The surprise in his words felt like a declaration of war, and immediately, Blake sensed the seriousness of the situation. This was no longer simple mockery. This was a real confrontation, a test not just for Blake, but for the pride of all soldiers. He could not allow these people to continue insulting the honor of a soldier like this. Despite the tense situation, Blake kept his calm. He did not rush to respond. He stood there, his eyes locked onto the young man, unwavering. Part of him wanted to charge immediately, but the other part, the part trained to maintain discipline, would not allow it. He knew that if he acted now, everything would spiral out of control. But the silence did not last long. As the young man stepped closer, Blake could feel the shift in the air, the change that he could not deny. The young man moved toward him with a smug expression, his hand raised as if to shove Blake aside. Blake did not step back. He stood straight, his hand gripping his gun, ready to face whatever was coming. But then, Unexpectedly, a change occurred within the group. One of them, who seemed to have lost patience, suddenly stepped back. "Let them go," he said, his voice filled with fear. "It's not worth it." These words took Blake by surprise. This was the first time someone in the group had not continued the challenge. But instead of easing the situation, it only made the atmosphere more oppressive. Blake realized that these were not simply unruly youths, but individuals who could harbor more dangerous intentions. The leader still did not back down, but his eyes no longer held the same confidence. The arrogance in his gaze had shifted to a vague doubt. Yet he could not afford to lose face in front of his friends. He took another step forward, pulling another member of the group toward Blake. As the young man closed in, Blake could not wait any longer. He knew that if he did not act now, the situation could escalate too far. And he also knew that, regardless of the rules, he could not just stand by while a respected man like Jeffrey Stone was being disrespected. Blake pushed the young man aside, drew his gun, and looked straight at the leader. "Step back. If you do not stop now, I will not hesitate to take stronger measures," Blake said, his voice cold as ice, without a trace of hesitation. Blake's eyes never left the leader, and in that moment, the leader realized that, no matter how many sarcastic words he could throw, he stood no chance in front of Blake. A brief silence lingered, and then, in the tense stillness, the group of young men withdrew. But Blake could not rest easy. The feeling that this was not yet over haunted him. As they retreated, the young man left one last parting word. "This is not finished." The scene around began to settle, but within Stephen Blake, the tension had not yet dissipated. The group of young men had stepped back, their eyes filled with a mix of anger and fear. They seemed not entirely defeated, but Blake's presence, strong and resolute, had made them hesitate. Even so, Blake could not shake the feeling of unease weighing on his chest. The words of the group, their challenge and disdain towards Jeffrey Stone, still echoed in his ears. Facing such a small group of adversaries, a soldier like Blake could not help but feel unsettled. Blake turned, his eyes resting on Stone, who had been standing silently all this time, still maintaining his firm posture, as if unaffected by what had just occurred. However, there was something in Stone's demeanor that kept Blake from looking away. Though his outward appearance was calm, Blake could sense the weariness in the way he gripped his cane, in the way he held his medals on his chest as a statement. Not to anyone else, but to himself. Stone had lived through many wars, endured countless trials, yet now, in moments like this, he was confronted with an enemy unarmed. Not bullets or bombs, but disrespect. Blake could not help but wonder, why was this happening? Why should a man who had devoted his life to the country face such humiliation? He looked at Stone, not just with the eyes of a royal guard, but also with the eyes of a comrade, of a soldier who understood what sacrifice truly meant. He could not allow this to continue, could not stand by and watch a hero be cruelly degraded like this. At that moment, a thought suddenly crossed Blake's mind. Had he acted too hastily? The rules of the Royal Guard were clear. Do not intervene in situations outside the scope of protecting the monarchy. Do not intervene unless there is a clear threat. But Stone was not an ordinary tourist. He was a man who had sacrificed for the country. And despite the rules, Blake could not turn a blind eye to this violation. His mind began to swirl between two worlds. One was the rules, the discipline he had followed for the past 12 years. The other was compassion, the view of a man's dignity, the responsibility he felt to protect. At this moment, Stone seemed to sense the confusion in Blake's heart. He looked at him, his deep eyes tired from years of battle, but still resolute. A glance that did not need words, but was enough for Blake to understand. You did the right thing. A light breeze blew through, carrying dry leaves, but the air still felt heavy, as if everything was waiting for a breakthrough, a decision that could not be undone. Stone approached Blake, his gaze determined, yet full of gratitude. "Thank you," he said, his voice deep and warm, but without weakness. Only acknowledgement. An acknowledgement that Blake's action was not only protecting him, but something greater, a noble value few still understood. Blake bowed his head, a small but respectful gesture. But what troubled him was not the actions of the young men, but the reaction from his superiors. He had violated the rules, a violation that could lead to serious consequences. But at that moment, what mattered more than anything was that he had done the right thing. He could not allow the respect for a soldier, even one retired, to be violated any further. A heavy feeling rose in Blake's chest as he thought about the possibility of being investigated, disciplined. He knew that, given what he had done, it might not just be a warning. But Blake also understood that, for what he was protecting, it was necessary, not for recognition, but for self-respect for the core values he had trusted all his life. Just as Blake prepared to turn and return to his position, a shout rang out, breaking the silence. "Stop!" One of the young men, the one Blake had pushed away earlier, called out from a distance. It seemed he had not yet given up, was still unwilling to accept defeat. Blake turned unshaken. This time, the young men did not just stand still, but advanced, their heavy steps filled with hostility. In his eyes, failure before Blake was not something easily accepted. He would rather continue the confrontation, rather create chaos, than bow his head and admit defeat. Blake sighed inwardly, but his resolve did not falter. He looked at the group, his gaze steady, without the slightest hesitation. If confrontation was necessary, then he would face it. The choice was not retreat, but an act of righteous protection. Each step of Blake echoed on the cold stone ground, cutting through the tense and heavy atmosphere that enveloped the palace grounds. The group of young men, after a few seconds of hesitation, began to move forward with eyes filled with hostility and unmasked anger. It seemed that the silence that had lasted earlier only made them angrier. At that moment, Blake could not help but notice that the threat from these individuals was not just physical, but a challenge to everything he believed in. What they were doing was no longer a joke. It was an insult to a person who had sacrificed his entire life for the country, and moreover, it was a challenge to the honor of a royal soldier. Blake's gaze was cold, as though all emotions had disappeared, leaving only absolute focus on the steps of the group. He no longer felt the inner conflict he once had. He no longer wondered if he was doing the right thing. His decision had been clear from the moment he stepped away from his position. Yes, he had broken the rules, but in this moment, he knew there were values that nothing could replace. And protecting the honor of a soldier, whether a veteran or a new recruit, was a duty he could not refuse. The young man in the lead, with his tall frame and eyes full of defiance, stepped closer to Blake. His hands were clenched, as if he had decided that he would not back down any longer. "Who do you think you are?" he shouted, his voice full of challenge. "A soldier, a wooden statue standing here, just for show? Do you think you can stop us?" Blake stood still, not reacting immediately. In his eyes, the young man was not worth wasting words on. He was just someone seeking attention, a weak individual hiding his insecurities behind crude words. But what Blake saw in his eyes, arrogance, self-satisfaction, was something Blake could not forgive. He was not just insulting Jeffrey Stone, but all those who had sacrificed for this country. Blake took a deep breath, but he could not suppress the feeling of anxiety in his chest. He knew that, although he could face anyone, the reaction of this group was unpredictable. Could they stop? Was there a push or a sudden move that could make everything spiral out of control? "Don't test me," Blake spoke, his voice not quick, but full of determination. His eyes locked onto the young man, showing no sign of fear. He understood that if the young man did not stop right now, there would be no choice but to face him. But in Blake's heart, there was still a faint hope, a weak desire that everything could end without violence. The young man in the lead sneered. "What will you do? How will you drive us away, huh?" He took another step forward, seemingly unafraid, or at least not willing to back down in front of his friends. He turned to the others, signaling them to move up. At that moment, one of the group members, who had been hesitant before, stepped forward and placed a hand on the leader's shoulder. "Enough, that's enough." His voice was soft but still loud enough for the others to hear. "You see, we don't need to do this." His expression was no longer full of arrogance, but now, it seemed as though he had come to realize something that the rest of the group could not see. Blake looked at the hesitant young man. He seemed to be the one not in charge, merely caught up in a game he did not truly understand. Blake knew that he might not be the main threat, but his presence revealed a deep contradiction within the group. A part of him wanted to break free, but another part was still drawn to the frenzy of the leader. This was a battle not just between individuals, but a struggle between right and wrong, between courage and weakness. The leader, seeing the wavering in his group, grew even angrier. He shoved his teammate aside and turned back to Blake. "Do you think you can stop us? Try it." Blake no longer spoke. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them. His gaze was now as sharp as a knife, as decisive as a stone. The leader charged at Blake, but Blake was ready. He pushed him back with a powerful move, effortlessly causing him to stumble. The others in the group watched, but no one dared intervene. A silence enveloped the space, and all that could be heard was the strong beat of Blake's heart in his chest. Suddenly, the leader quickly turned back, his eyes full of fury. "What's this? Don't think you can dominate us so easily." He pulled his hand back, preparing to attack Blake again, but this time, Blake was prepared. With a fast and precise motion, Blake grabbed his arm before he could act. Blake's grip tightened, not too hard, but enough to prevent the young man from moving. "Step back. Don't try again," Blake said, his voice calm, but still cold and commanding. "Stop now, before I do something none of you want." The entire group froze, no one saying another word. For the first time in this confrontation, they felt Blake's strength and determination. Their once defiant and self-satisfied gazes had shifted, now appearing timid and fearful. The tension in the air was suffocating, but they all knew the battle was over, not through violence, but through a powerful assertion of authority, honor, and duty. Blake did not step back, showing no signs of weariness or fear. He stood firm like a symbol of protection, of a soldier who had learned what mattered most, protecting dignity and honor, no matter the cost. The scene before Stephen Blake seemed to have come to an end, but in his heart, the atmosphere still felt stifling, like a storm that had not yet passed. Although the group of youths had withdrawn, the tension within him did not easily fade. What he had just done, intervening in a situation beyond the royal guard's domain, breaking rules, and confronting enemies who were not afraid, was not something that could be easily resolved. Blake stood upright, maintaining the perfect posture of a royal guard, but he felt that something was shifting deep within his mind. That feeling was like a warning bell he could not ignore. In that moment, as he stood facing Jeffrey Stone and protecting him from insult, Blake felt as though he had crossed a line. Although his actions were meant to protect honor, to prevent the violation and contempt of a man who had sacrificed so much for the country, Blake could not help but wonder, am I on the right path? He was not a man who rushed into things, nor one who acted thoughtlessly. Every move he made was carefully considered, especially since he was a royal guard, a person caught between discipline and the responsibility of protecting the crown. But this time, everything had changed. He had broken the rules and made the decision to defend honor, to protect the dignity of a person, without considering the consequences that could follow. As Blake's gaze rested on Jeffrey Stone, a veteran who had dedicated his life to the country, he realized that his actions were not only about protecting a soldier, but about a greater struggle. The struggle between the core values he believed in and the rules that might fall short when faced with humanitarian situations. Stone said nothing, but in his eyes, Blake saw a look of appreciation and understanding, as though he knew that Blake had done the right thing, but also knew that this action would lead to an uncertain future for Blake. "Thank you," Stone said, his voice deep and resonant, but no less powerful. "You did not just protect me, but also the values we have kept for our whole lives." Blake felt these words like a weight pressing down on him. He wasn't just being thanked for his intervention. Stone was also acknowledging Blake's action in standing up when honor and self-respect were threatened. But those words also made Blake feel the tension within himself. For although his actions could be seen as justified, the consequences were far from insignificant. He could not help but think of the reaction from his superiors, his colleagues, and those who would judge his actions. Blake's calm demeanor remained unchanged, but deep within, everything felt different. He knew that with what he had done, discipline would never be overlooked. He had broken the rules, not only for humanitarian reasons, but also because of his deep belief in the righteousness of his actions. Every step he took had value, but it also meant that he would face punishment. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed behind him. A soldier from the Royal Guard approached, his face showing little emotion, but his eyes full of sternness. Blake turned around and recognized the soldier as Thomas Hall, a longtime colleague who always valued discipline and strictly adhered to the rules. "Blake," Hall called, his voice low and filled with authority. "Did you do the right thing?" The question was not a criticism, but an inquiry, as if he were trying to gauge whether Blake fully understood the consequences of his actions. Blake felt Hall's sharp gaze, and in that moment, he knew he could not escape the truth. "I did what needed to be done," Blake replied, his voice unwavering. But inside, he could not deny a sense of unease. He knew his actions might lead to criticism from others, and possibly tarnish his reputation in the eyes of those who valued rules and discipline above all else. But that did not matter at this moment. However, Blake also understood that his protection of a soldier's honor, even a veteran, was not a simple act. It was a defense of all the values they represented. And no matter the consequences, Blake would not regret it. Hall did not say anything more. He looked at Blake for a moment before turning away. Hall's words still echoed in Blake's mind. Every decision has its price. But Blake understood that this was not a warning. It was a reminder, an acknowledgement that in a soldier's life, it is not always possible to follow a standard pattern. Sometimes you have to stand up for what is right, even if it means paying the price. The surroundings of the palace had now quieted down. The hurried footsteps of tourists had disappeared, and the chatter of conversations was no longer heard. All that remained was silence, as if everything had stopped to reflect on what had just happened. But within Stephen Blake, this silence carried an indescribable sense of unease. Every decision he had made in that moment came at a price, and he understood that it was not a small one. He had broken the rules, had dared to stand up to protect someone, not for personal gain, but for something greater, something that transcended the norms he had been trained in for so many years. But still, that action haunted him, not because he wasn't proud of it, but because he knew that his choice could affect not only his future, but also the career to which he had dedicated his entire life. Looking at Mr. Jeffrey Stone standing beside him, his eyes filled with gratitude, yet mixed with the profound understanding of a soldier who had endured countless hardships, Blake sensed that, for the old man, his action was not just a temporary protection, but a reminder of the sacred values he had defended throughout his life. That gaze from Mr. Stone seemed to affirm that sometimes protecting a person's honor and dignity was more important than adhering to rigid rules. Mr. Stone turned to Blake, his voice deep and full of understanding. "Thank you, my boy. But do not let your sacrifice be in vain. What we do today, whether big or small, matters. What's important is that we do what's right, even when it is not easy." These words were like an invisible thread, pulling Blake away from the heavy thoughts clouding his mind. He had done the right thing, not for recognition or praise, but because he had defended the values he believed in. Blake's steps no longer felt as heavy. He didn't know what the future held or whether he would face discipline from his superiors. But one thing was clear to him. Soldiers are not only meant to stand to protect the royal family. They are also meant to stand up for what is right, to protect what they believe is justice, honor, and dignity. When Mr. Stone left, Blake stood alone for a long time, not to blame himself, but to absorb the lesson he had just learned from life. It was not a lesson about discipline or merely following a simple rule. It was a lesson about courage, sacrifice, and self-respect. He realized that sometimes it is in those moments when you stand firm while everything is against you that you come to understand more about your true nature. Sometimes standing up is not about winning, but about protecting things that cannot be replaced. While Blake stood there, another soldier, his longtime comrade, Thomas Hall, approached. But this time, Hall's gaze was no longer sharp or stern as before. Instead, it was filled with respect. "You did the right thing, Blake," Hall said softly, his voice full of understanding. "There are things in life that cannot be judged by the rules. You protected the most valuable thing we have, honor and self-respect." Blake looked at Hall, a small smile appearing on his face. He understood that sometimes The people around him may not immediately understand, but time would teach them. Blake's action was not just his decision alone, but a reflection of the entire system of values he had been trained to defend. And no matter what challenges lay ahead, Blake would not abandon what he believed in. As night fell, the golden light of the sunset reflected on the walls of the palace, a reminder of perseverance and resilience in life. Every soldier has his own duty, and Blake's duty today was to protect those values. He understood that no matter the price, those values would live on. In those moments, Blake realized that life cannot always be based on rules. Sometimes, it is the human values, the lessons of courage, self-respect, and duty that guide us on the right path. And in that moment, Blake deeply felt that a soldier not only protects the nation, but also defends the noble things that not everyone can see.